He stood alone at the edge of the dock, the worn brim of his cap casting a shadow over his eyes. No one knew his name, no one cared. But that night, when four young surrounded a woman near the water's edge, it was his voice that cut through the darkness. By morning, the town of Beaufort would remember the name Walter Briggs. Before I share how that happened, tell me where you're watching this from. And if you believe that honor never fades, hit subscribe so you don't miss what I'm about to share with you tomorrow. The salt air hung thick over the small town of Beaufort, South Carolina. The old oaks stretched their limbs, draped in Spanish moss, as if they were trying to hold on to the last light of day. The docks, worn and weathered, creaked beneath the weight of time and tide. Walter Briggs knew those docks better than anyone. At 73, his hands bore the calluses of decades spent fixing the things most folks didn't notice. Motors that kept the ferries running, electrical systems that flickered back to life under his steady fingers, cables worn thin by salt and wind. He was a dock worker, yes, but in another life, he had commanded respect from men who wore the uniform, who followed him into the unknown. But here, in Beaufort, he was just the old man with the limp, working nights because no one else wanted to. His jacket smelled of grease and salt water. His boots thudded heavily on the planks, the rhythm of a man with nowhere else to be. The town's younger crowd barely spared him a glance. Some whispered that he'd never amounted to much. Others called him a relic, a leftover from a time no one cared to remember. But Walter never answered those whispers. Earlier that day, before the night wrapped Beaufort in its quiet grip, Walter had made his usual stop at Murphy's General Store. He needed a new set of spark plugs for the ferry's backup generator, the one that coughed and sputtered every other week. The bell above the door chimed as he entered, its familiar ring sharp against the low murmur of conversation. Behind the counter stood Kyle, a young man barely out of high school who always wore a smirk like he knew something others didn't. Walter placed the worn-out spark plug on the counter. "Got a set of these?" he asked, his voice rough, but steady. Kyle didn't look up right away. He glanced at the plug, then back at Walter with a tilt of his head. "Still patching up that old rust bucket?" Kyle chuckled, loud enough for the two teenagers leaning near the candy rack to hear. "Maybe it's time they replace you and the boat." The teens snickered. Walter didn't flinch. He just stood there, hands in the pockets of his oil-stained jacket, waiting. Kyle grabbed a dusty box from the shelf and tossed it onto the counter. "Here, might hold for another week," he muttered. Walter slid the cash over without a word, but as he turned to leave, one of the boys near the door leaned in toward Kyle and muttered, "He's limping, blind and filthy. Just look at him." The words hit harder than they should have. If that had been the worst of it, maybe Walter could have brushed it off. But Margaret Delaney was there too, tucked in the corner, stocking shelves of preserves. She was the widow of old Murphy, the store's founder, a woman with silver hair always tied back neatly, eyes sharp as a hawk's. She'd heard the exchange, caught the sneer in Kyle's voice, the mockery in the air. She met Walter's gaze for a brief second as he passed by. No pity, just quiet acknowledgement. Like she knew there was more to the story. But she said nothing. Walter stepped out into the waning sunlight, spark plugs in hand, the weight of whispers pressing harder than the tools he carried. He walked back to the dock, alone, as always. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the docks as Walter Briggs settled into his routine. The generator's hum filled the quiet air while he tightened bolts and checked connections. His limp made every step deliberate, the old injury, in his left leg, throbbing a steady reminder of battles fought long ago. The station lights flickered to life, buzzing faintly overhead. Walter stood back, wiped his hands on a rag, and surveyed the ferry that would cross the river at dawn. It wasn't much, peeling paint, worn rails. But it held together because he held it together, and no one noticed. The town didn't see the silent guardian keeping its heartbeat steady. They didn't know the man who rose before the sun. To ensure the cables were taut, the motors oiled, the lifeboats checked. They just crossed the river each morning without a second thought. But Walter didn't mind. He'd grown accustomed to life in the shadows. That night, after locking up the maintenance shed, Walter made his way down the dock to the boat ramp where the moonlight rippled across the water. He paused, leaning on the railing, the weight of the day pressing on his shoulders. That's when he heard it. Raised voices, a woman's protest. He turned his head toward the parking lot just beyond the dock. Under the flickering street lamp stood Margaret Delaney, her silver hair catching the light. Her old blue Ford pickup had stalled. The hood popped open, steam curling into the air, and around her were 4 young people, all in the tail end of their teenage years. 3 boys with worn leather jackets hanging loose, 2 of them the same, who had mocked Briggs earlier that day in the store, and a girl with purple streaks running through her hair. Their laughter echoed in the empty lot as they edged closer to Margaret. Walter's jaw clenched. His limp didn't slow him as he crossed the dock. Margaret's voice trembled. "I told you, I don't need help." "Oh, come on, lady," one of the boys jeered. Jake, the tallest of the bunch. "Wow, it's impressive you still remember how to drive. After all this time, huh?" one of them said. "This car is just like you, old and in need of a few new parts." The disrespect kept piling on that widow, stranded alone on the side of the road. The others laughed, circling her like sharks. One of them kicked a rock toward her car, the clatter sharp in the night air. Margaret backed up, her hands clenched, into fists at her sides. Walter stopped at the edge of the lot, standing under the street lamp. His voice rang out low and steady. "That's enough." The group froze, their heads snapping toward him. Jake squinted, recognition dawning. Well, well, if it ain't the dock rat. Walter stepped forward, closing the distance. His limp was more pronounced on the uneven gravel, but his posture remained solid, unyielding. "Leave her be." The girl snorted. "Or what? You gonna chase after us with that leg of yours?" Walter's gaze didn't waver. He stood squarely between Margaret and the kids now, his eyes locked on Jake. "I've seen boys like you before. When I was 20, I met them in places you wouldn't last a day. Now turn around. Go home." There was no bluff in his voice, no shouting, just the weight of certainty. For a moment, the air thickened. Jake's jaw clenched. He looked to his friends, searching for courage, but it didn't come. Something in Walter's steady gaze, in the way he stood despite the limp, cut deeper than threats. It was the look of a man who had nothing left to prove, but would stand his ground. Jake scoffed and spat to the side. "Whatever, old man." He turned, gesturing for the others to follow. Their bravado crumbled as they walked off into the night. Margaret stood silent for a beat, watching them disappear. Her breath came out in short bursts. Walter turned to her, softening. "Truck overheated?" She nodded, still shaken. "I think so. I don't really understand." Walter studied that blue pickup closely and began searching for the problem. The way he examined it felt so natural, as if man and machine were one. Within minutes, he identified that the engine had overheated due to a lack of water and noticed the belt was worn out. He quickly fixed the most urgent issue and advised Mrs. Margaret to get the car checked before the belt snapped completely. Margaret finally found her voice. I don't even know what to say." Walter wiped his hands on his rag, shrugged. "Don't worry about it." He tipped his cap and started back toward the dock, the limp steady but strong. Margaret stood by her truck, watching him disappear into the dark, her heart racing for reasons she couldn't yet explain. Tomorrow she would start asking questions about the man who stepped out of the shadows that night. The next morning, as the first light broke over Beaufort, Margaret Delaney stood in the storeroom of her shop, checking over the inventory. The encounter from the night before weighed heavy on her. The faces of those boys, the sound of Walter's voice standing firm, it played over and over in her mind. She couldn't let it go. As she moved through the store, organizing shelves and greeting familiar faces. She asked around, "Anyone know much about Walter Briggs?" A few shrugs. A shake of the head. "He works the docks, right? Keeps the ferries running." "That old guy?" "Keeps to himself." But no one really knew, until Donnie, the retired postman, leaned against the counter, sipping from a paper cup of coffee. "Briggs? He's been here a while. Came back from the war, I think. Keeps his head down." Margaret pressed. "Which war?" Donnie scratched his chin, thinking. "Vietnam, maybe? Hard to say. He doesn't talk much about his life." That wasn't enough. Margaret needed to know. After closing the shop for the afternoon, she walked to the docks, her shoes clicking against the wooden planks. The smell of salt and oil filled the air. Walter wasn't there. His tools were neatly arranged on the workbench, a rag draped over an old motor. Her eyes drifted to the small office beside the shed. The door was ajar. Inside, on a wall littered with ferry schedules and maintenance logs, something caught her eye, a faded photograph curling at the edges. Walter Briggs, much younger, stood at attention aboard a naval destroyer, his dress whites crisp, a medal pinned to his chest. Behind him, the American flag billowed against a bright sky. Margaret stepped closer, reading the plaque beneath the photo. USS Richmond K. Turner, DLG 20, Citation for Bravery, 1972. Her breath caught. She didn't know much about the military, but she knew enough to understand what that meant. Walter Briggs wasn't just a dock worker. He was a decorated veteran. Word traveled fast in a town like Beaufort. By that evening, Margaret had spoken to the town historian, Harold Green, who dug through old archives, pulling out yellowed newspaper clippings and service records. It all came together like pieces of a puzzle long forgotten. Walter Briggs had been a petty officer first class aboard the USS Richmond K. Turner, serving during some of the fiercest years of the Vietnam War. One night in 1972, during an enemy ambush along the Gulf of Tonkin, Briggs had led a team to rescue dozens of crew members trapped below deck after an explosion rocked the ship. He saved lives, but he never spoke of it. When he returned to Beaufort after the war, Walter disappeared into a quiet life. He never joined the veterans' meetings, never marched in parades. He chose solitude. Margaret stood at the front of her store the next day, a photo in hand, showing it to every local who passed by. Did you know about Walter? Shock. Curiosity. A sense of guilt settled over the town. Kyle, the young clerk from the store, stood frozen when Margaret showed him the photo. His smirk faltered, the color draining from his face. "That's him?" Margaret nodded, her gaze steady. "That's him." Kyle swallowed hard, the weight of his mockery crashing down on him. It didn't take long for the mayor to hear, and then the local news station. And then veterans from nearby towns. By week's end, a plan was in motion, a ceremony, right there on the docks. Not a grand event, but enough for the town to make it right. At first, Walter refused. When Mayor Thompson approached him with the idea, Walter shook his head, wiping grease from his hands. "I'm not that man anymore," he muttered. But Margaret wouldn't let it go. She showed him the photograph, placed it on his workbench. "You never stopped being that man," she said, softly. Walter stared at the photo for a long time. His hands trembled, but he said nothing. The day of the ceremony arrived under a clear Carolina sky, the sunlight dancing off the river, as if the town itself wanted to make amends. American flags fluttered gently along the docks, tied to railings and lampposts. The smell of salt mixed with fresh-cut flowers laid out neatly at the podium. The town gathered slowly. Veterans in worn caps stood shoulder to shoulder with young families, retirees, and fishermen. The air buzzed with quiet anticipation. At first, Walter Briggs wasn't there. The mayor cleared his throat at the microphone, nervously scanning the dock. But then from the far end, Walter appeared. His work boots worn, his jacket stained with oil, but his posture straight. His cap pulled low, shadowing his face, but the limp that marked every step was unmistakable. Margaret stood near the front, arms crossed tight against her chest, a soft smile playing at the corners of her lips. As Walter approached, the crowd parted, murmurs softening into silence. For the first time in years, all eyes were on him. The mayor stepped forward. "Walter Briggs," he began, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "It's long overdue that we recognize not just what you've done for this town, but who you are." The mayor gestured toward two men in uniform, representatives from the Navy, who had come bearing a framed commendation and a fresh service medal. Walter shook his head, a quiet protest on his lips, but the applause had already begun. A slow, rising wave of gratitude from the townspeople who now saw him clearly for the first time. Standing near the back were the 4 teenagers from that night. Jake, his bravado long gone, stood beside his father, Mr. Henderson, a broad-shouldered man with grey streaks in his hair, a veteran himself, who had served in the Gulf War. As the applause died down, Mr. Henderson leaned close to Jake, speaking low but firm. "You owe that man more than words." Jake swallowed hard, his eyes fixed on Walter. "I know." His father's grip tightened briefly on his shoulder, grounding him. After the ceremony, as the crowd mingled and people approached, Walter to shake his hand, Jake, flanked by the other 3 teens, stepped forward. Walter turned, catching sight of them. His expression didn't harden. He waited. Jake cleared his throat, voice low. "I'm sorry, Mr. Briggs," he said, eyes downcast. "For what we said, for how we acted. I didn't know who you were, but I should have shown respect anyway." The girl with the purple streaks shifted nervously beside him. She took a half step forward, her eyes shimmering with regret. "I'm sorry, too. I shouldn't have mocked your leg," she whispered. "I was just stupid." Walter's gaze softened. He nodded once, acknowledging the weight of their words, but he said, pointing at Mrs. Margaret, "I appreciate the apology, but the one who truly deserves those words is that lady you disrespected so much." All of them, ashamed, mumbled apologies. To Margaret. Their voices were weak, but sincere, promising they would never speak words like that again. Mr. Henderson stepped forward, his presence towering over Jake. "He'll be volunteering at the docks, Mr. Briggs," he said firmly. "Learning the value of honest work." Walter studied Jake for a moment, then gave a slow nod. "Work starts early," he said, his voice steady but not unkind. Jake nodded, swallowing his nerves. "I'll be here." The other teens exchanged uneasy glances, but Mr. Henderson wasn't done. "After school, all of you. 1 week helping with repairs, or you can explain it to the sheriff." No one argued. As the sun set over Beaufort that evening, the river shimmered beneath streaks of orange and gold. The docks stood quiet again, but something had shifted. Walter Briggs returned to his routine, tools in hand, checking the ferry's lines, but this time he wasn't invisible. Behind him, Jake and the other boys showed up the next morning, work gloves on, ready to learn. And somewhere in the rhythm of engines, cables, and the soft hum of the river, respect was rebuilt, 1 bolt, 1 knot, 1 lesson at a time. Because honor doesn't fade. It endures quietly, waiting for the day someone chooses to see it. If you believe respect should never be forgotten, type respect in the comments and share this story. And if you don't want to miss what I'm going to share with you tomorrow, hit subscribe.